Okay, this is an RPG classic that came out back in '96, the original Star Ocean game. It is one that was overlooked back in the mid '90s, mainly because the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was starting to decline in popularity by that time because the PS1 became very popular during that time period. Also, the N64 came out a little bit later that year, or actually came out that same year. Um, that Star Ocean was released exclusively in Japan. Was a game that was developed by Tri-Ace and published by Square Enix. And I believe that, like, this game, it was pretty unique because it was one of the few games or a few JRPGs from the 16-bit era that utilized voice samples within like gameplay and all that stuff. And that's basically what made Star Ocean kind of stand out because it showed that the developer was able to push the limitations of the 16-bit SNES console in terms of gameplay and all that stuff. So that was pretty impressive, and a lot of people would argue that this is a game that should have appeared on the PS1 or a different console because or it at least should have been released in America for that regards. I mean, that's a thing that a lot of people have always questioned. Why was the original Star Ocean game not released in America? It's because the 16-bit console was starting to decline in popularity by the mid '90s. Okay, despite the fact that the Super Nintendo was popular, and even to this day, it's still very popular. A lot of people were going crazy over 3D gaming during that time period, and this was a game that I feel like if it was released in America, it may not have had the type of success that it would have had back in the early '90s. Like if it was released anytime between 1990, maybe 1993, then yeah, I could see Star Ocean being far more successful, possibly hitting 1 million copies in sales, especially considering the fact that at one point the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was the top video game console in the world, because I believe its only competitor at the time was the Sega Genesis, Neo Geo, which was too expensive. Nobody was going to buy that. And I think that's about it for the most part as far as competition is concerned. So this is definitely a 2D JRPG that I feel like it was released or it came out a little too late. If it came out a couple of years earlier, it definitely could have been more successful than it was. It would have been cool to even have seen this game ported for the 32-bit Game Boy Advance console back in the early 2000s. I'm not quite sure why that never happened, and I'm not quite sure on whether or not having the original Star Ocean game on Game Boy Advance back in the early 2000s would have made it more of an attraction than it would have been in America back in the mid '90s, because you got to remember, from the mid '90s onwards, and this is even true throughout the most of the 2000s, violence has always been an attraction within America. Games that emphasize blood, gore, and violence have always been huge attractions in America. The only difference is the blood, gore, and violence in the '90s was more fighting based, while in the 2000s it was more just based off of shooters, whether they be first person or third person shooters. And Star Ocean, I mean, it was eventually re-released in America at some point. I believe it appeared on the PSP back in the late 2000s. I believe it was 2008. And this is before it appeared on the PlayStation 4 and the Nintendo Switch back in December of 2019. So if the original Star Ocean game appeared on the Game Boy Advance back in the early 2000s, that would have been pretty cool to see, but I don't think it would have been as much of an attraction as it could have been for the SNES if it was released anytime between 1990 and 1993.